So good morning, everyone. My name is David Kelton. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College, and I also have the pleasure of holding the Dairy Farmers of Ontario Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Health. Welcome to our Dairy Research and Innovation Day. This is an event, showcase event for dairy at Guelph, and I'll say a few more words about dairy at Guelph later on. But to start off our program here this morning, we're very fortunate to have the deans of both OAC and OBC with us, Jeff Wichtel in the back there, and Rennie Van Acker from OAC. And to get our program going, Rennie has agreed to say a few words of welcome.
I'm not sure why I was picked to be, the token administrator. And the reason I say that is because the wonderful thing about Dairy at Guelph is that it cuts across the university so broadly. And I think it's a wonderful demonstration here today, and you'll see through the talks of just how it cuts across so many disciplines and so many of the colleges. But indeed, it's a pleasure to say a few words here and to congratulate the organizers, Dave, Stephen, Giselle, for putting together such a wonderful agenda, for getting such a wonderful turnout. I understand that we have a lot of walk-ins, which is wonderful. I think there are some extra chairs here up at the front. I had a chance to briefly meet Dr. Britt, who's the keynote today. And the University of Guelph has always been involved in dairy in some way, shape, or form. We have a long, long tradition, both on the supply side and on the demand side. And as most of you will know, we have recommitted ourselves in dairy here at the University of Guelph, not only in wonderful people like Giselle, for example, who's now an NSERC IRC, but also in facilities. And I can think of a couple of examples, one on the supply side and the new dairy facility up at Elora, which is really a world-leading and now apparently fully occupied facility, which is great, but also on the demand side. And we've been thrilled in OAC and with the leadership of Art Hill, who's here for the redevelopment of the Guelph Food Innovation Center. And within that, the addition of some key pieces of equipment, not least of which high-speed, high-temperature pasteurizer to allow us a capability for not only leading research, but working directly with industry to serve not only far-term, but near-term and immediate industry needs. So all that being said, I wish you a wonderful day here. Congratulations to the organizers. My apologies, I can't stay. I have to run off. I wish I could stay. I would much rather be here all day, believe you me, than there is HR issues I'll be dealing with today. But I congratulate the organizers, and I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rennie. And while they're both here, I want to express our thanks on behalf of the Dairy at Guelph group to both Rennie and Jeff. This kind of a group doesn't get off the ground without some resources behind that. And we sat around the table, we had an idea, and the deans of both colleges bought into this and have been really supportive of what we've done. And I hope today will be a bit of a reward to showcase some of the things that we've been able to do with the support that we've had from our administration. So again, thank you both of you for having the faith in us to drive this forward. So we've got a full program for you today. As Rennie said, our goal is it's a bit of a showcase. It's a bit of an opportunity to share with all of you who are here today some of the exciting things that are going on across the breadth of the dairy spectrum. One of our strengths here, I think, at the University of Guelph is that we touch all aspects of dairy production, from from all the way from the soil right through to human health, and we'll try to showcase some of that today. Just to give you, I think some of you know a little bit about Dairy at Guelph. We launched our brand about 2 years ago. We had our first event at the Delta in May of 2016. This is our second sort of major event, and we hope to make this a little bit more frequent as an opportunity to showcase and interact with you with some of the things that we're doing. As a group, we're somewhere around 65 or more faculty, and that number changes as people come and go, but across the value chain. We represent 12 departments in 5 of the colleges at the University of Guelph, so it truly is a cross-cutting endeavor. And we've got a whole cadre of postdocs, graduate students, undergraduate students, research associates, and staff that make Dairy at Guelph what it is, and such a strong and vibrant, I think, group. In addition to that, we've got some phenomenal external stakeholders and partners. We call it Dairy at Guelph, not Dairy at University of Guelph, because we embrace all and we include all our partners, not only in the broader Guelph area, but in southwestern Ontario, that work with us on a day-to-day basis and allow us to do some of the wonderful things we do. And I think we've been quite successful. Typically, on an annual basis, we manage to secure more than $5 million in external research funding, and those numbers, I believe, are growing, so we're pretty pleased with that. As we mentioned, we touch just about everything across the value chain in dairy, right from the input side, crops, feeds, water, through cows and health, genetics, and welfare, right through the farm environment from the standpoint of environmental stewardship, engineering, economics, products and product development, marketing, understanding the market that's out there, and right through to human nutrition and health. And you'll see some of these things highlighted today in the presentations. Where we work, Rennie mentioned a couple of the locations. At the top is a picture of our dairy research facility up in Elora, which is a phenomenal facility. If you haven't been there, we invite you to come for a visit. Rebecca Rudis, who's over there, is our outreach director for that facility, and she gives tours on a very frequent basis, and it's a wonderful facility. We have the Guelph Food Innovation Center, and we have a lot of other institutes and centers at the University of Guelph where we make our homes and do our work. As I mentioned, we have a lot of partners without whom we couldn't do the things that we do. And just as an example on this slide, those of us that work on the animal health and welfare side, just a bit of an example of some of the groups and organizations that we work with that fund us, that we cooperate with, that we partner with to do some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. And without those connections, those partnerships, we couldn't do what we do, and we thank all of those groups, all of you who are here for that support and that interaction. We continue to grow, and just as an example, a few people who have joined our Dairy at Guelph group just in the last year or so, Mike Steele and Dan Tulpin in animal biosciences. I know Mike is here. The food sciences, Jeff Farber and Longtak Lim. Longtak is the new director of the Guelph Food Innovation Center. And on the bottom, Charlotte Winder and Dave Renaud are both here as well in the Department of Population Medicine. So we continue to add strength and some great ideas, some vibrant participation in Dairy at Guelph. Our steering, we've got sort of an informal steering committee. And again, many of you will know some of these folks: Christine Bays and Trevor DeVries from Animal Biosciences, Giselle Lapointe from Food Science, Mike Von Massow from Food, Agriculture, and Resource Science, and Stephen LeBlanc and myself from Population Medicine. The gentleman lower right-hand corner, Dan Lacroix, and where's Dan? Oh, he's hiding. Okay, Dan's hiding over there. Dan joined us a little over a year ago, and he's our administrative assistant, and he's really the brains and the workhorse behind the things that we do, and we certainly appreciate Dan. You'll have a chance to meet him and welcome him to our team. We have a website, as any good group needs to have, dairyguelph.ca. We have a YouTube channel. Kevin Hogg is here, and he'll be recording some of the presentations today that'll be then available through the Dairy at Guelph website, through the YouTube channel, and so again, another opportunity to get our information out there into the hands of the users. And so we think of ourselves as really doing work on behalf of the dairy industry, in support of healthy food from healthy cows in a healthy environment. And again, thanks to particularly the deans of OAC and OBC for their support as we've launched this initiative. So that's a little bit about who we are and what Dairy at Guelph is. And without further ado, we'll get into the program for today. We've got a number of speakers. The sessions, for the most part, for the rest of today are fairly short. It'll be a little bit of an overview and some introduction to some key areas, but we thought what a great way to launch this event would be to have a keynote address and bring in somebody that we all, I think, will really enjoy hearing, and I'll ask Stephen LeBlanc to come forward and introduce our keynote speaker this morning.
Thank you, Dave. And for those of you who are just trickling in at the end, there's a bunch of seats down here at the front if you want to come and make yourselves comfortable. So I have a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jack Britt to you. Jack's an emeritus professor from North Carolina State University. He's had a varied and even storied career with a lot of accomplishments. He was first a very productive researcher. He was a teacher first at Michigan State and then later at North Carolina State. He was the father of the Britt hypothesis, which is a very well established theory, but that's continued to hold water about how the experiences of cows in terms of their health and metabolic environment going back right to the very earliest stages of the development of their oocytes influences their fertility months into the future. And from farmers who would make the observation that cows that live through a tough transition period are harder to get pregnant, to now some very advanced molecular research that's going into putting some meat on those bones. That's the kind of win that many of us in research would dream of having in our career, something with your name on it that people actually have to learn about. But not only that, that's actually really held up to the test of time and really helped advance science. But Jack also had a very productive career as a researcher and increasingly senior administrator at University of Tennessee, progressing to be the executive vice president of that entire university. He officially retired from there some years ago, but he's hardly retired. He's continued to be extremely active as a thinker. It wouldn't be an overstatement to say a visionary for the dairy industry, as an entrepreneur, a consultant, and an investor and partner in a number of startup companies, even beyond agriculture. What you'll hear about from him this morning is the fruit of a project from an invited lecture, and again, you'll hear that he's not the sort of person who would be content to just do a really good job with a thoughtful lecture, but in fact this one lecture at his alma mater some years ago has turned into a bit of a roving project, and some really interesting thinking about some of the forces that shape the dairy industry in the United States, Canada, and in fact globally, that I think you'll find really interesting food for thought for the industry that we all work in. So with that, it's our really great pleasure to have Jack here with us. We're going to hold the snowstorm off the south to let him get home for American Thanksgiving. But right now, we've got him here for the next hour to share thoughts and visions. So please join me in welcoming Jack Britt to Dairy.
Thank you, Stephen. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. I first came to Guelph, I think, in 1974, when I brought a group of dairy students from Michigan State University that we had a spring dairy trip to Ontario to visit farms. The Guelph dairy students hosted a party for us that night, so I remember that fondly. And on my trip here, I stopped and spent the night with some dairy friends nearby, and got really more acquainted with what's going on in Ontario. But it's a great pleasure to be here. As Stephen indicated, I was asked to give an endowed lecture at Michigan State University in the spring of 2016. And they asked me 9 months in advance, and I thought they were wanting to come and talk about my career or something that I had done as a teacher or a researcher. And they said, we want you to talk about the dairy industry in Michigan 50 years from now. Fortunately, they gave me 9 months. But I knew I couldn't address that issue independently or by myself. So I sent independent emails to a bunch of my colleagues who were my age or maybe slightly younger and asked them if they would participate in the project. They didn't know who else got the email. So 9 of them said they would. So then I sent a series of questions to each one independently. They all got the same questions, but they still didn't know who else was getting the same questions. And they all responded to those questions. How many cows will we have? What will be the milk production? What will be the products? What are we going to be feeding them? Where's the market going to be? What are going to be the health issues? And so I took the answers to each one of those questions and put them together under each question. And then I sent the email with all of the names and all the questions and all the responses back to the folks that you see on the bottom of this slide. And we still collaborate at least weekly. I was in Cameroon last week for 3 days, for example. Gordy Jones was one of my undergraduate advisees a few years ago. And so I engage with these folks, and when we see something new in the news or in the literature or something new in science, we say, how does this fit with the dairy industry? And so it's been a fun activity. We've had no grants. We've had no financial support. We volunteered our time. We published an 18-page journal article in Journal of Dairy Science and paid for our own page charges. So that's how much we sort of bought into this fun trip for old folks, retirees. And so that's an introduction to how we got started. Now, 50 years seems like a long time, but I can go back 65 years. We moved to this farm in 1952. We built this dairy barn in 1953. We started milking cows on a farm in Kentucky. We had a 4-in-line, side-open stall, de la Valle barn, and on a good day, we could milk about 18 cows an hour. And so that was the level of automation and robotics and systems at that point in time. You can see the kind of equipment. That tractor in the lower right-hand side is my Huber tractor, which you don't see today. That's my grandfather driving that tractor. I was born during World War II. My dad was overseas when I was born. And I'm a clone. The doctor didn't know, the mother didn't know, no one knew that she had twins. She delivered my brother 7 months early, and 15 minutes later she delivered me in a hospital that didn't even have an incubator in a rural community. We weighed 3 pounds and something apiece. But anyway, so I'm cloned from a veterinarian, and that's him in the lower left-hand corner. And unfortunately, he passed away earlier this year with Parkinson's disease. But we really did a lot of things together over the years. And so he was a veterinarian and I was a research scientist. And so we connected really on many levels. And I think that was a stimulus for both of us. That cow is a 10-year-old cow who was in the first heifer crop on our new farm. And you'd probably like to have a cow like that in your herd today. Now, she wasn't producing a lot of milk. She produced almost 17,000 pounds of milk, and that at 8 years of age. But that was 6 standard deviations above the national average at that point in time. And so that gives you an idea of how far we've come over the last 65 years. Why is dairy important? I think that's a question that we all need to understand. These data are from a study that was published a couple of years ago in which they asked the question, if we took all of the farmland in the United States and we farmed it according to the recommendations of the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which says for Class 1 land, you treat it this way, for Class 2, you treat it this way, for Class 3, you treat it this way, in terms of continuous cultivation or grasses or rotations or whatever you might have. How could you produce the most nutrients? What kind of diet would we have to feed the most people with the available land? And the best diet was a dairy-based diet connected with a vegan-based diet, because the vegan-based diet does not provide many of the essential amino acids and nutrients that we can get by adding dairy. And you can see an egg-based diet was almost as good as a milk-based diet or dairy-based diet. Vegan ranked fourth until you get way out to a very high population level, and then they sort of all run together because you maximize the total production system. And so dairy is important because we can meet the needs of the nutrient needs of people in the world that are essential nutrients by using some dairy in the diet. And so I think that's what the world has to benefit from over the next few years. The biggest challenge I think we're going to have in feeding the world over the next 50 years is the changes in population that we see. These are projected changes from the United Nations. They're the sort of the middle projection. And what you see is that over the next 50 years, 93% of the growth of population in the world is going to be in Asia and Africa. And of that, 83% is going to be in Africa. So the market for the food that is produced in the world is going to be outside of North America. It's going to be outside of Europe. If you look at the European area, population is going to decline. So demand for food is going to decline. Latin America and Caribbean is going to be increasing slightly. That's mostly in Central America, not in South America. North America is just going to increase a little bit. And it's hard to predict because most of the growth in North America over the last 50 years has been immigration. So if our immigration processes change, we could actually see a decline in population in North America. Oceania is not going to change very much. So the huge market of the world in terms of the food that's being produced, dairy that's being produced, grains, oil seeds, whatever, is going to be really in Africa and Asia. The other thing that one observes, if you look at the developing cities, developing nations like Nigeria, for example, as people move from the rural areas to the urban areas, they have more income, they have better jobs, they have better education. Dairy intake is increasing 6 to 10-fold in many of those areas as you move from a rural to an urban area. That's kind of an unusual observation, I think. You would think that rural folks are going to consume more dairy. But in fact, it's the economic ability to buy new products that is really important. And so we're going to see 50 years from now, the demand in dairy will be equivalent to 5 times the amount of milk produced in North America every year. That is the increase in demand that we're going to see 50 years from now. That's a lot of dairy. But it's going to be a different kind of product. And what we don't do very well, at least in North America, is work with those countries to find out what are the products that you really want to consume. It's probably not going to be fluid milk that we ship to Nigeria or to Mozambique. It may be UHT. It may be a new culture product. It may be a sour milk product. It could be a new kind of cheese with different spices or salts or additives, not additives, but herbs that would be in the cheese, something different. And so we need to be in those countries today, testing new products and finding out what would people really like to consume, what are their dietary needs. I've been to China a couple times this year, and we talk about lactose intolerance. It'd be hard to prove with what I see the Chinese eating that they worry too much about lactose intolerance. And so I think some of our myths about what people will or will not eat will change as we develop products to feed the world. But this is where our big challenge is going to be, is in those growing areas. Now, if you look at the population trends over the next 100 years, we're going to reach a peak, something around 11 billion, and then the fertility rates are going to decline enough that we'll actually see population going back down. It may go back down to 9 billion people in the long run. So, but we've got 100 years of really tight fit between the amount of food that's going to be available and the population that we're going to see. Now, the question that I sort of posed for you today is, what role is Canada going to play in feeding the world 50 years from now? This is the exports from Canada for 2017. And you can see that Canada is exporting a lot. Oilseed, cereals, and all those products. But look at the dairy number. It's extraordinarily small relative to all of those other products. So is Canada going to be a player in feeding the world? And I'm not here to help to make that decision, but you're the folks that are going to be helping make that decision in the future. So I think that's a question that needs to be in your mind. What role is Canada going to play? And can it be profitable to play that role? You're in a great location for several reasons. One is you've got great transportation across the country, and you can go either east to the Asia or west, or excuse me, east to Africa or west to Asia from your ports. So you have some real advantage in terms of access to markets. Only a few countries in the world produce the most milk. We look at 200 countries are in the FAO database for dairy production. 10% of those countries, 20 countries, produce 75% of the world's milk. We don't see that changing a lot. We're going to see production increase in some areas, but it's these leading countries. Right now, Canada is about 1.3%. There's no reason why it couldn't be 8 or 10%. And we'll talk about the reasons for that as we move ahead. The other challenge we have is that the productivity among countries is extraordinarily broad. These are the countries that have the most dairy cows, and that's the number in parentheses beside the country. India has 46 million dairy cows. That doesn't include dairy buffalo and other milk-producing animals. And Brazil has 23. There's 147 million cows in those countries, dairy cows. And you can see that in some of the countries, the average production per cow is under 300 kilograms per year. That's not sustainable. There's no way that the world can have 173 million dairy cows with cows producing 300 kilograms per year. I mean, that's where all the methane's coming from. It's not from the high output countries. It's from these countries that have millions and millions of lowly productive cows. And so that's the challenge really for the whole world. I think we're going to see countries like China make a big increase in milk production. Pakistan's actually making a significant improvement, and probably India will. But still, we're going to be only able to, for countries that are mostly in Asia and Africa, are going to be able to produce about 70% to 80% of what they actually need, and some significantly lower than that in the future. I think Canada is going to be a big benefactor of climate change. Now that may sound like odd because the doomsday folks are talking about how bad climate is going to affect countries, but 81% of the people in the world, 82% of the people in the world live north of the equator, live in the northern hemisphere. 81% of the food is produced in the northern hemisphere. So the northern hemisphere is the area of the world that's going to be impacted by climate change, much more so than the southern hemisphere. Canada is going to have a longer growing season by 6 to 10 weeks than today. It's going to be warmer in the winters, so you're going to have a later freeze in the fall and earlier thaw in the spring. So you're going to be able to grow longer day corn crops, higher yield crops. You're going to have more rain. The coastal areas of Canada are going to be less affected than the prairie areas. So if I were an investor in land, I would be buying land in the prairie provinces right now for my dairy farm that I'm going to move in 40, 50, or 30 years from now. So I think that's a golden opportunity, and so Canada needs to figure out how do we take advantage of that. I think Canada and Russia and northern China are the areas that are really going to benefit in some ways from climate change and offset the adverse effects that we see in some other parts of the world. In the United States, 42% of our current milk is produced in areas that are not going to have any water availability 50 years from now. Those are those dark areas on the map. It's not going to be temperature that causes the dairies to move. It's going to be lack of water availability. 42% of our milk is going to move somewhere else. And we think it's going to move to where water is available, which is really the Great Lakes region, the upper Midwest, and Canada. So there's really an opportunity if Canada has sort of the right plan to grow the dairy business in the future. Because these places in California and Arizona and New Mexico, Colorado, Idaho, Texas, Kansas, are not going to have the water available to produce the crops to feed the cows. And so that's going to be an adverse climate impact, at least in that part of the world. We also think that production per cow is going to continue to increase. These are our estimates. We did a real sophisticated analysis. We took the existing data, put it on an Excel spreadsheet, and we did a linear extrapolation and an exponential extrapolation. So that was the sophistication of our model. But this shows you sort of the range of where we could be. We think we're going to be at around 25,000 kilos per cow per year in North America in 50 years. And we already have herds that are at that level. And we already have cows that are producing at 35,000 kilos. In fact, if you take those high-producing cows and adjust to energy-corrected milk, put them on a constant fat and protein basis, we actually have cows producing 40,000 kilos already. And so that's the magnitude of the potential. We've looked at New Zealand. New Zealand, which has a grass-based system, is growing their production at exactly the same slope rate as the United States. So we're seeing this increase in yield in cows. That middle graph in the middle there comes from the Canadian Dairy Network, and it shows that top line is the change in the trend of annual increase in yield associated with moving to genomics. And so we don't think the increase is going to be linear. The increase is going to be something toward exponential because of genomics. But we also think, we started working on what kind of milk should we produce for the future. We're going to be looking at producing more components per kilogram or per liter. And we're even going to be looking at fatty acids in that milk and specific caseins in that milk. And so farmers are going to get paid much more for the chemical makeup of the milk and components than they are the volume of the milk in the future. When we were looking at cows, we wondered, is there a biological limit? So how do you study biological limits? So what we did was take the highest yield in the United States for the last 3 years and compare that in standard deviation units to the average yield for 2014. And we did it for cows. We said, what about crops? So we also did it for corn and soybeans. And you can see that the top yield in the last 3 years, 3 to 4 years, is 7 to 12 standard deviations above the average yield. So it doesn't look to us to be any really genetic limit on potential. You hear people say, we've reached our biological limit, we can't go any higher. But there's certainly not any evidence, at least in these 2 crops and in dairy cows, that that's happening. And so that is encouraging, I think, that we still got to have the water and the fertile soil and the nutrients, but there's a lot of biological capacity there. The other thing that we've seen, we looked at New Zealand and the United States. We're going to continue to have volatility in prices for milk. We don't see any way around that because we can increase production a lot more quickly than we reduce production. And so this is the last 15 years or so in the U.S. There's a 70% difference. These are inflation-adjusted dollars, so constant dollars. There's a 70% difference in constant dollars of what farmers receive for their milk over the last 15 years in the U.S. In New Zealand, that is 75%. So that volatility is something that we will have with us. So farms have to be resilient. Only 40% of the time is it above the average, and 6% of the time is below the average in both countries. So we have to understand how to have resilience on our farms, or stability or sustainability, in order for the dairy industry to be successful. And that's a challenge for us, I think, everywhere. Herds are going to continue to get larger. This shows the distribution of herds of cows and herds of different sizes in the U.S. from 1969 through 2017. You see in 2017, over a third of the cows in the country were in herds of over 2,500 head. And the primary reason for that is really associated with efficiency of utilization of resources. And that's the challenge that small farms have, is they use their resources with very low, very poor efficiency, whereas larger farms do a better job. When I was in China recently, I was asked to talk about profitability in the United States and dairy farms, and they said, we don't want government data, we want real data from real farms. So I was fortunate to have some good contacts. These are real data from 103 farms that average 4,299 cows per farm in the United States from the financial records for 2017. Most farmers in the U.S. did not make any money. They lost money in 2017. These cows, with over 4,000 cows, netted $359 per cow. That's $2.2 million per farm. So those enterprises were making money when most of our dairy enterprises were losing money. And it's really spreading all of the fixed costs over more cows to live. It's operating the parlor 24 hours a day rather than 6 hours a day. It's all of those things that are associated with lower efficiency when you have smaller operations. I mean, that's the way business operates. That's why we have a few car makers in the world rather than 1,000 car makers in the world. Now, we think there's a way that small farms can capitalize on what big farms do. And that's a model shown here. And that is to share resources. In this case, we've got a common transition barn in the middle that all the cows go through. And they're there for maybe 3 weeks before calving to 3 or 4 weeks after calving, and they get supreme care, understocking rates, all those things that you have to do, milking 4 times or 6 times a day to give the best care to those cows. And then they would move to what we call milk cow herds, and those are robotic herds. They would be all alike. So it doesn't matter whether the cow goes to robot A this year and robot B next year. She already knows how to use that system. And so that reduces the cost per farmer, the cropping cost per farmer. And you share calf facilities and dairy beef facilities and dry cow facilities. I was in Israel 30 years ago visiting an area. There were 42 farms that averaged about 150 cows that had one feed center. When I say one feed center, I don't mean one feed mill. I mean one feed center that had all the forage, they did all the harvesting, they stored all the hay, they stored all the silage, they prepared all the TMRs for 42 farms. They used the land that those farms had. But basically, they had a farming operation that they all did together. And that greatly reduced the cost of feed for all the farmers because they didn't have to have all the equipment they needed to make feed for a small operation. So that's a concept that would fit in today's Canadian system very easily. And so I would encourage you to think about sort of those approaches. Part of the thing that you see there not only is reduced costs, but compliance with protocols. I think what the big farms do best, do better than anyone else, is compliance with protocols. Steve and I were talking yesterday. I'll tell you an interesting story. I have a friend who's got some very large dairies in Texas. And he was having problems in the milking parlor with consistent protocols in terms of prepping the cows, putting on machines, moving machines, dipping, sanitating, and so on. His somatic cells were bouncing around him. And he just wasn't very happy. And he said, how do I deal with this? And we know you want the cow to be prepped and wait a certain time before you massage and it's attached, and wait a certain time before the machine comes off, and wait a certain time before you dip and let the cow out. We know what those times should be. But it's not easy to control that. So he developed an offensive team and a defensive team. Everybody in the parlor has a jersey. 1, 2, 3. So number 1 starts prepping cows. And number 2 can't move in his offensive position until number 1 gets to the 6th cow. And number 3 can't move in his position until number 2 gets to the 7th or 8th cow, whatever it is. When they did that, they have an offensive play, which is prepping, and defensive, which is at the end, when you dip, heats, and sanitize. Their somatic cell counts dropped, their milk production went up. And the guys don't always wear the same numbers. Sometimes number 1 gets put on someone else. So everybody learns how to lead a team and know the steps in between. You know, that's kind of a common sense approach that has completely changed their consistency, kind of innovative. And so sometimes I think we have to think about how can we introduce things like that into our management. The other thing that we're going to see in the future is a lot of robotics and sensors and automation. This is a Hyundai manufacturing facility in Alabama. How many people do you see working on that assembly line? If you look closely, you see 2 people sort of hidden back in the corners with a keyboard operating and managing all the robots. And so we'll see a great increase in artificial intelligence and sensors and automation and robotics on farms in the future. We're saying that in the future, 80% to 90% of the work done on dairy farms will be done robotically or with systems, automated systems. We'll have sensors in the fields, in the streams, in the silos, in the barns that all talk to each other. These will be integrated systems. All of that will be in the cloud. We'll really know what's going on in the whole ecosystem, if you will, and what's contributing good or bad by capturing those kind of data. I've got 2 arrows on there. The one on the lower left, that is a biodegradable chip with human cells growing on it. So can we put the biodegradable chip in the udder, or the liver, or the rumen, or the uterus, and monitor what's going on there in the future with a radio telemetry reader when the cow comes in the milking parlor? And that may be the way we're monitoring systems and health to know what's going on in the future. And if it's a biodegradable chip, we don't have to worry about taking it out. On the very right is a system that's called the Genica system. It was developed in Africa, funded largely or significantly by the Gates Foundation to handle waste in small communities that do not have sewage treatment plants. It was basically designed to handle the human waste in those communities. We have a dairy in the United States that's building one of those right now. I know where it's going up. They expect, in fact, they've got a system already capturing more phosphorus out of their manure than they actually apply to the fields. Already happening on the farm, large dairy farm, actually 10 farms connected together. They're making methane out of the manure and converting it into compressed natural gas, operating all their tank truckers that are hauling the milk with the methane coming off the manure. They expect to recycle 82% of the water on the farm as potable water within 5 years. So that's the kind of change we're going to see in technology, in ecosystems, and eco-management. And that is only going to be affordable for larger size farms. A 35 cow dairy is not going to be able to handle that sort of system. And so that is one of the drivers for having larger farms, because they're going to be much more beneficial to the ecosystem, to the wildlife, to the water quality, to the soil, to all those things that are happening. The other thing that we have this idea that we do the wrong thing in terms of studying dairy. As an animal scientist, you start out studying the animal, right? And then the granting agency says, well, that's not specific enough, so you start studying the organ. You start studying the liver or the udder or the uterus or whatever. And then that's not detailed enough, so you start studying the cells. You're culturing the epithelial cells and you're culturing cells. And then that's not good enough, so you have to start studying the genes. And then pieces of genes, and then RNA. That tells us nothing about a herd. You know, a herd is what we call, but as shown by the bees, a superorganism. Superorganisms are things like bees and termite colonies, animals that share the same space, eat the same feed, exposed to the same diseases, dealt with the same individuals, exposed to the same climate. Doesn't that sound like a dairy herd? So we really need to take an approach in the future, and you've got a wonderful opportunity to do that, to figure out what makes herds that are in the same geographic area, that have the same feeds, have the same environment, have the same weather, and basically have the same genetics, differ a lot in terms of their health and productivity. What is there that's going on in a herd in terms of compliance and details in information management or whatever that causes herds to differ? If we understood that, that would be the most effective teaching tool that we would have to help farmers improve and to train workers. And so that's something that we need to pursue, and that's not a particularly expensive kind of approach. We could probably use some data mining and maybe some sensors to look at compliance, or even cameras to look at compliance from time to time, to figure out why do farms that are in the same region differ? What's going on there? Now we're going to see some changes in the cow in the future. I'm always amazed at the arguments among the breeders. You know, the Ayrshire breeders and the Jersey breeders and the Holstein breeders and the Brown Swiss breeders and the Hereford breeders and the Angus breeders. They want a pure breed. No other genes in that breed. Breeds were created by mankind. Nature did not create breeds. Nature created genes. So why do we think it's so terrible to move a gene from one breed to another, particularly if it's a beneficial gene? So we need to start thinking about how do we create lines or crosses. We've debated, our team really has debated a lot whether it's going to be crossbreeding or line breeding. But I'm saying, if we took all the Holstein organizations, the big Holstein organizations in the world, and said, okay, we're going to develop 5 lines of Holsteins for 5 latitudes above and below the equator, that might be the best thing that we could possibly do in terms of creating more business. Because we got more genes, and we know more about the genes in the Holstein breed than anywhere else if we take all the genes for all the Holsteins around the world and start thinking about the future rather than who's going to win a World Dairy Expo and the Royal next year. And so I think that's an emphasis that we ought to put on the future, is creating special breeds that will go into special niches around the world, around the globe. We can do it. That would not be a very complex problem. We've done it before. We just need to have the wherewithal to do that. We'll be doing some gene editing, I think, in a very restricted kind of way. We can move genes from one breed to another breed pretty easy with that. Cows are going to be healthier, more fertile, polled, producing A2 milk. I've been doing some calculations on, and I think the North America, at least in the U.S., we need 4.2% fat, 3.1% protein, certain caseins and fatty acids. We need somatic cell counts less than 200,000, and A2 milk. We could do that if we had the wherewithal to say, hey, that's what's going to be. That's not a government regulation. A processor or a co-op could decide tomorrow that that's what we're going to do. And so it just takes the intuition, I suppose, or the initiative of our leaders to get that done. There'll be some proprietary genes in the future, sort of like proprietary genes in crops. So cows may make a product because they have some sort of genetically engineered gene put in them that will be a valuable pharmaceutical or a valuable resource. And they cannot sell offspring from those animals, but it will be a very high value lactation product when it's produced. This is simply an example that I use to show to local town folks when I have meetings in the evening with people who are not farmers about what gene editing is like. We both have paternal and maternal chromosomes. On the left, we have the paternal and maternal chromosomes both have the horn allele. And with gene editing, CRISPR type of technology and related technologies, basically what we do is cut out that specific sequence of DNA, that specific gene, and simply replace it with the complementary gene for the polled animal. And it's not quite as clean as that because, as you know, sometimes you drag other pieces around and do CRISPR, but the techniques are getting better. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't do something like this to move genes among breeds rather than doing crossbreeding over 10 or 15 generations. If we don't do it, somebody in the world is going to do it, unbeknownst to us, and all of a sudden they've got these cattle for these genes that are on the market. And so that's sort of where we are with that, I think. We also think in the future we're going to be breeding in the petri dish. We already know that if we take stem cells and put them in a petri dish from the mammalian or blastocyst stage, and we treat them with growth factors, different sets of growth factors, some will differentiate into oogonia and oocytes. Some will differentiate into spermatogonia and spermatocytes. And if we treat them then with biotic factors, they will undergo meiosis. And when you've got that stage, you can put them together and create the next generation next week. So we think we could go through 5 or 6 generations in 5 or 6 weeks and do genomic testing on all those and find out what is really sort of the ideal set of genes that we want. And once we get that embryo, we can propagate those. And in the future, we're going to be, the breeding companies are going to be mostly selling embryos, not semen. Because our genetic potential will be to produce really high quality embryos. And that's where we'll be, I think, in the future. The Chinese have already published how to do this in the mouse. If you do it in the mouse, you probably do it in the cow. The other thing that we think is going to change in the future is sort of how we look at genetics. If you look at the black bars on the left here, those are the heritabilities of many of the traits that we look at in dairy cattle. When you add those up, it accounts for 19% of the variation in what we measure in dairy cattle. 81% is over on the right side, which we're calling that environmental genetics, or we use the term also epigenetics, because epigenetics is really an environmental driven change in genetic expression. And we're learning that epigenetics methods or processes are much more complex and much more common than we have expected them to be. Stephen mentioned the Britt hypothesis. This is a paper we published in 1992. We took some data that we already had and looked at body condition scores in the cows. And that's that graph in the middle. And you see we had one group of cows, Holstein cows, which essentially maintained their body condition score. We had another group that lost a lot of body condition, and then they returned back to, out there at 10 weeks, they both had about the same body condition score. Those cows were inseminated by artificial insemination without timed AI or anything. They were just bred at detected heats. And the conception rates were 62% versus 25%. So our hypothesis was those cows that had the loss in body condition, something was going on during the transition period that affected that oocyte. At that time, we really didn't know how long it took from when an oocyte was activated from a primordial stage to get all the way to the ovulatory stage. Most of that work had been done with Canadian scientists many years ago. But we finally have figured out it's about 101 days. When that big follicle over there on the right ovulates, that oocyte is in about 101st day after activation. So you can see that its first 20 or 30 days after it was activated during the transition period. And so our hypothesis was there's something going on there that affects the quality of the oocyte. Now there's lots and lots of data that's just pointing to the high levels of fatty acids that are mobilized in those cows that are losing weight, having an adverse effect on the oocytes. And probably through the cumulus cells that are around the oocytes, you can actually see RNA transfer moving from the cumulus cells into the oocyte when stuff's going on. So it's probably an epigenetic type effect. But what really was sort of the icing on the cake is this data on the left here, published from 2 large farms in Wisconsin. This was published in 2014. So they looked at body condition scores in cows. They had 789 cows that lost body condition score in the first 3 weeks. And their timed AI conception rate was 25%. They had 675 cows that actually just maintained their condition score in the first 3 weeks. Their timed AI conception rate was 38%. Lo and behold, they had 423 cows that gained condition in that first 3 weeks. And their timed AI fertility was 84%. I mean, no one could imagine an 84% timed AI conception rate. In fact, the nutritionists who were co-authors on this paper, when they first started looking at data, they said it's impossible for cows not to lose weight and produce milk. But then they went back and looked at all their old data, and when they started looking really independently, one-on-one at records of the old data, they had cows a long time ago that were not losing any weight. And no one had really paid attention to that. Now on the right is a study published recently from Israel. And what they did is look at cows over 5 consecutive lactations in the herd. And they have a load cell scale says the cows leave the milking parlor, their weight every day. So they knew exactly the weight on all these animals. And cows naturally segregated into 2 groups. Those that were big weight losers and those that were smaller weight losers. And the smaller weight losers are more fertile, healthier, live longer in the herd. So I think 50 years from now, it will be unusual for a cow to lose weight during the transition period. And that will be a major impact on the health and fertility and longevity if we can do that. There's no reason why we can't do that. Their lactation persistency is going to be a little different. They may not peak quite as high, but they may produce more milk longer than we see in our typical cow today. We already see things associated with epigenetics that we're using in practice. On the left, we know if we milk fresh cows 4 times a day, or up to 6 times a day in the first 3 weeks, and then go twice a day, they will produce more milk for the entire lactation than if they're milked 2 times only that whole period. So something about the frequent milking in the first few weeks after calving stimulates those mammary cells to produce more milk for the whole lactation. And that's clearly an epigenetic effect associated with nursing. Jeff Dahl's group in Florida published an abstract at the Dairy Science meeting this summer. I think it's pretty fascinating. They cooled cows in the last 46 days of pregnancy by putting it by misters and fans and cooling it. And so the first generation you see at the bottom, they had cows that were cooled or not cooled. The blue is the cool, the red is the not cool. And those cows that were cooled produced more milk than the ones that were not cooled. But then they looked at the daughters and the granddaughters. And if you were a daughter or a granddaughter of a cow that was not cooled during her late pregnancy, then your production is lower than your granddaughters. So that's probably an epigenetic effect associated with methylation of the DNA or histone protein sublimation or something that is actually passed from one generation to another. The only way we're going to discover these kinds of things is not through science the way we traditionally do it. It's through taking huge databases and simply looking at some event and then looking forward at hundreds or thousands of records and say, what happened? after that event. Whether it was mastitis or whether it was heat stress, maybe the hoof tremor was there. So those are the kinds of things that we need to be mining as we have available data sets. We need to get more data in the cloud so we can just go look for things like that. And what that will allow us to do then is to allow farmers to do a better job of managing around those kinds of events, preventing those events in the future. We're going to see a great change in the future in managing the microbiome. Genomics in the future is not going to include only the cow's DNA and RNA. It's going to include the DNA and the RNA of all the microbes that are in the cow. So genomics is going to take a whole new change, and we're going to replace a lot of the drugs and chemicals that we use today in managing herds and farms by managing the microbiome of the animals and soils and crops on the farms. And there's still this debate about when is the microbiome established, for example, in the young calf. There's some pretty good data that says a cow's microbiome is established in her first 2 days of life, maybe the first day of life. So I suspect that we will give colostrum to a calf that has been spiked with an optimal microbiome culture in the calf's first fed colostrum to establish the microbiome that's going to make the healthiest calf in the future. That's a great opportunity for someone to start exploiting that. If I had any kind of microbes or probiotics, I would start putting probiotics and microbiomes on every label of everything that I produce, because that's what folks are interested in. When I talk to the public, I talk about probiotics or prebiotics rather than microbiome. But really, what we're talking about is managing all those microbes and cells. We're going to be using that in agronomy. There's already a bunch of bacteria that you put on seeds, you get better yields, you get healthier crops. We're talking about huge influences, mostly because it improves the relationship between the roots, the hairs on the roots, and the soil ecology. And if we can get the right sort of mix of microbes in the soil by putting it on the seed, that's going to be a whole lot better than putting an insecticide on the seed. And it's going to help our ecosystem. We're going to see it in the environment, in our waste management systems. We'll be managing the microbes there. There may be some cow-specific microbes that we give to cows, and the robots that are doing that based on identification in our system. Some cow has some condition or disease, and we picked up something with a mastitis test. So she's going to get a microbe fed by the machine. And we probably will have some that are therapeutic. But for some reason, they're going to be licensed as a prescription in the future. And we'll be using those to replace a lot of the antibiotics and drugs that we use today. So become a microbiologist, I guess, is my advice to you. I'll finish with this story. In 1961, I remember watching this. President John Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. In 1961, the United States did not have a rocket to go to the moon. We did not know how to calculate an orbit of a satellite going around the moon. We did not have an orbiter that would actually go around the moon that someone could ride in. We didn't have a lunar lander that would go down to the moon and people get off and put the flag and wave the camera and get back on and go back up to the orbiter and come back. We didn't know how to do any of that. But it was the vision that Kennedy had that drove us to do that in 9 years. And it wasn't the government that developed all those technologies, it was industry, it was people. I mean, the scientists did that, they did their part. But it was the vision that got us there. So my suggestion to you as dairy at Guelph is to create a vision for dairy in Canada 20 years or 30 years from now. If you have a vision of where you want to be 20 years or 30 years from now, that's where you'll be. If you don't have a vision, who knows where you're going to be? So once you get your vision put together, send it to me.
we'll give you some feedback on it. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jack. We've got time for a couple of questions for Jack, if you have them. He'll be with us here till about just after lunch, but if there are some questions right now, the floor is open. You're overwhelmed developing new visions. Oh, one here in the front, yeah, please.
Thank you for an outstanding presentation. Sure. What is it? Did you have some numbers in terms of the sustainability of water? I agree with you that a highly productive farm could actually compete against a vegetable protein production facility, but does it work out in every sense, water as well?
Well, that's a very good question. It's one about water availability in terms of producing food, kilo food, protein. Actually, water, it does work out. In the paper that I mentioned, they talk about water in there. And the water is really related to the type of soil and the land classification, whether you need irrigation or not. We irrigate a huge amount of the world's agricultural crops. Not in North America. I mean, we really put a pretty low on irrigation in North America, even in the West, compared to most other places. But there's going to be a great opportunity with water to conserve it, and I think the greatest opportunity is to clean it up and reuse it, make water recyclable, so you're not using new water over and over, you're using water that you've already used several times. And so that's really going to be the opportunity on the farm, is to just make much better utilization of water. The new irrigation technology of using ribbons, if you will, or strips that go about 6 or 8 inches or 15 centimeters under the crop rows is going to be the way we're going to irrigate 50 years from now. We're not going to have flood irrigation, sprinkler irrigation. It's all going to be in the row. And you can double the yield with using 80% less water when you do that. Because you're putting the water exactly where it needs to go. They've been doing that in Israel for quite a while. We're starting to see it in the United States. If you're looking at vegetable growers in California or in North Carolina, that's the way they're putting water on the plants right now. So we're going to see that, and that greatly increases the irrigation.
Yeah, we hear more about plant-based meats or even cultured meats. I don't hear the same thing about dairy. Is that a possibility for our future?
That's a good question. Yeah, we're hearing a lot about plant-based meats. And basically, they're using meat cells to grow meat cells. I'm not sure you can make a fine filet mignon, but you sure can make hamburger doing something like that. So we looked at dairy. Could dairy, through fermentation, compete with dairy produced on the farm? And we said, well, what is the oldest fermentation product that we produce in the world that we all consume and is produced very competitive? Beer. And beer cannot compete today with the price of milk produced on the farm. So if beer cannot compete, I don't see how dairy product, which is much more complex than beer, is going to be able to compete with dairy produced on the farm. And I may be wrong. And some people are going to pay for that humane milk, if you will. But if you're going to feed the world, it's probably going to be with grass and grain and forage crops and stuff that humans don't eat.
That was a fascinating insight. That was a businessman, not a scientist. What prompted you to look at the superorganism from that perspective, and how important do you think that is in the future? And I'm a Welshman, and thank you for the beer reference.
Right. The superorganism. There's a professor at Cornell who wrote a book entitled Honeybee Democracy. He's an expert on honeybees. And so I really got enthralled with how a hive behaves, even managed hives. he's got a whole bunch of hives in his backyard, all setting on a scale, electronic scale. So he monitors every day. I mean, he's got a bunch of those scattered around everywhere. Exactly what the bees are eating and how they behave, and if a disease comes along in a hive, what happens to it. So that's really where that concept came from. And if you haven't read Honeybee Democracy, it's a fun read. He's a great scientist. He's actually a neuroscientist who works on bees. And so he learned, they learned a long time ago how bees communicate. We know exactly how bees communicate. We have no idea how cows communicate. If we could figure out how cows communicate, we could teach the robots to communicate with the cows. We could really change how cows behave. If you've been a robotic farmer, cows love robots. You go into a barn that's had a robot for 3 months, the cows are much friendlier. You walk in amongst them, you know, they're like, hey buddy, let's do something together. And you know why? Robots do not show emotions. Cows like consistency. They may not like what the robot does to them the first 2 or 3 times, but after a few times through the robot, they know exactly what's going to happen. And that's different than the milker who comes in after kind of a rough day at work the day before, or having 2 sick kids at home, or drinking a little bit too much at the bar. And so cows like consistency. And we don't have consistency in our superorganism operations. And so that's why we need to study some of those things. What are the behaviors that go on? I bet you most of the differences is really associated not with the products we're using, but with what the people on the farm do moment to moment, day to day, in terms of compliance and accuracy and so on. Once we get to wireless, or not wireless, but driverless feed systems and automated feed systems, we actually have a lot more consistency on the farms than we have today. And so we may see the superorganism being a little more alive. But it's fun. I mean, it's fascinating to study beehives. I've read a lot about how beehives behave, and where they feed, and what they eat, and so on. And you see the same kind of variation that you see with dairy birds when you start looking at the details. So that's sort of where that concept comes from.
Thank you.
Really fascinating presentation. I'm starting to do some microbiome work myself, but in humans. So just was curious, in terms of the microbiome in dairy, is the microbiome in the gut the same as the microbiome in the rumen stomach?
The question he asked is the microbiome in the gut and the rumen the same? I don't know the answer to that question, but I would say no. In general, it's different, at least from what I'm aware of. There's an interesting study in Israel where they were looking at the fat production by cows, what percentage of milk cows in the milk. They had a group of first calf heifers, primal pairs cows, that calved together and were fed exactly the same diet. And you know, our idea is if you feed exactly the same diet, the microbiome will adjust to that diet that we're feeding. After they had been milking for several months, they started collecting rumen samples and fat and milk samples. Those cows did not have the same microbiome in the rumen. They probably had the microbiome they were born with, and the ratio of the 2 dominant phyla in the rumen predicted the fat composition of milk. It had nothing to do with what they were feeding. And our nutrition science, well, we can feed the right thing, we'll get the same. It was completely unrelated. And so I think getting that right microbiome established early in life is probably very important. And we need to figure out how to do that. A cow had just calved when we were at the barn yesterday, and the cow standing there licking the calf constantly to remove the placenta. And she's probably putting her microbiome on that calf right there. And so if we can understand that, I think we have a great opportunity to put the best microbiome on it.
Yeah. So in humans, the microbiome is established at birth.
Yeah.
With birth now. So there is differences between C-section infants versus natural birth. So it's right, actually in your
There's paper published in Science that said there might be a significant heritability in terms of microbiome among twins. And I was really interested in that. And it came from Vanderbilt, so good research team. But there's been some stuff published since then that said maybe it's not quite as high. They were talking about heritability of 0.3 to 0.4, and maybe it's not quite that high. There may be some. So that question is still open.
Last call. Please join me in thanking Jack for the